You know, the whole question of meditating is a question of pausing long enough to let things happen inside of you and to let things come to you.
Largely, it's a practice of waiting, which I don't do well, and I don't think many in our culture do well. We do projects, we have goals, we have lists. It's not something that I will give up. It's an important part of my life. But my meditative life is one of waiting. My conversation with Harry Scholefield began almost 20 years ago when I was a theological student and he was a minister in residence at my school. I remember one day he asked me about my devotional life. I mumbled something. I didn't really have one. Between my family responsibilities and the demands of my ministerial training, I felt I had no time. I've never forgotten his response. He said, "If you don't have a devotional life, you will dry up and blow away." His concern grew into a conversation that continues to this day. In these times, when we're all in danger of drying up and blowing away in the midst of our busy lives, we want to show you some practical ways to live with depth, meaning, and purpose. We call it living by heart.
I think my formal meditating pattern began when I returned from my sabbatical and realized how dominated I had been by my work. I was very angry because I felt I was being pressured all the time, and I began to not only reconsider my work habits, but I began to think you'd better find time to be alone. And I began meditating regularly. First, it was largely a walking meditation. And then gradually, because I have a natural affinity with poetry, I began to learn poetry by heart. By heart is taking it into yourself and letting it live within you.
I soon discovered that Harry's intentional approach to life included keeping a small book of words and phrases that were important to him. I began to do the same.
What I have here is the book in which I write things that I want to learn by heart. I want to incorporate into myself.
The by heart process is lived over a long period of time. It's not a collection. Poems are very important, but the by heart poems are of a different order. They're the ones that speak deeply to my experience and have etched themselves on my life. Those poems are very special and few. This practice of Harry's was much, much more than words or the simple memorization of poems. It was an approach to life, a way of greeting life. It was the practice of welcome.
We all have a much larger influence of saying what we will welcome, what will be welcome to us than we perhaps ordinarily think. So that the question of facing a day, welcoming it rather than trying to push it off, it's an extremely important option to learn to use.
One of the things I learned from you, which has been very important and very freeing, and I think is very different, is perhaps best couched in Tagore's words, "Mine is not the path of renunciation." It's the path of welcoming. I would say your path is one of welcoming. And that's it's a rigorous discipline, because we sometimes have to welcome things that we don't want to welcome. Because life gives us situations and purposes and even words that we don't want to welcome.
For me, meditating is a sustained practice which has implications for the whole 24 hours. And I have often felt it somewhat like planting seeds and keeping a garden.
After practicing for a period of time, I began to discover that the poems, the scripture, the words of wisdom that I was learning by heart were focusing my mind in my meditative practice. And as they focused my mind, my heart opened. So by heart memorization became a way of learning and a way of being at the same time. And as my heart opened, I found myself changed. Well, and the other thing, we tend to think of meditation as being needing to be in nature or in a quiet place without people, and is separate. And in this practice, you have conversation, you have nature, and you have the poets visiting, words, all of those intertwined at once.
And it's been occurring to me in the last couple of days that this, I always emphasize in my own thinking, meditating as a nourishment experience. And I guess you could draw the metaphor and say meditating sometimes is a meal.
In 1985, I was the minister of a wonderful church, but it was becoming clear that the time had come to seek a new position. Harry gave me the Rainer Maria Rilke poem, "My Eyes Already Touch the Sunlit Hills," and the practice of living by heart began to shape my life. I sat down with that poem every day for, my memory is, about 2 years, knowing that there was movement in my life. Something was moving, and I didn't know where, and I didn't know when, and I didn't know what it would mean. My eyes already touched the sunlit hills, going far ahead of the road I have begun. So we are grasped by what we cannot grasp. It has its inner light even from a distance, and changes us, even if we do not reach it, into something else which, hardly sensing it, we already are. A gesture waves us on, answering our own wave, but what we feel is the wind in our faces. Looking back, I can see that those simple lines helped me make the decision with freedom. I accepted a position in another church, in another state. The poet's words had kept me open to possibility.
The first thing that you do in a day is particularly significant. And for me, to walk out of the house into the darkness and sit for a while to experience the dawn coming is really almost a replica of the act of creation of the world.
Yeah.
You can choose your stance to a certain extent. Certainly circumstances are tremendously important, but we get into habits of greeting the day with fear. And there may be days you have to greet with fear, but it is also possible, and in my experience, feasible, to develop ways of facing the day with hope.
I often begin my morning meditation acknowledging my fears for the day. And it was with great joy that I began to realize that this is often the pattern in the Psalms, in the ancient Psalms, that, the psalmist is saying, my bones are dry, my enemies are camped around me, all is lost, where are you, God? It was a real songs of desolation. And then something happens. Often in the Psalms, something will happen, and you just feel like between one line and another, something shifted. And the psalm will end, I will sing praises forever, I live in joy and peace. And you know, if you read it, you say, what happened? And I know from my own experience in that same kind of pattern that it does happen. I don't know what shifts, but there is just a shift of spirit, so that within the meditative time I feel myself moved. And I can only assume that it's an experience that is ancient and deep in the human experience. Harry cultivates his relationship with all life as if it were a person he loves. He practices a special kind of kinship with life. At first, he used the word thou to represent that kinship. Over time, he found the word you to be more helpful.
I suspect that one of the reasons, sources that helped me, were the poets who use you. If I want to give an example of it from poetry, I use lines from Whitman, Whitman's poem, Song of the Open Road, where he says, you air that serves me with breath to speak. You objects that call from diffusion my meanings and give them strength. You light that wraps me and all things in delicate, equable showers. You hollows in the irregular pathways by the roadside. I believe you are latent with unseen existences. You are so dear to me. And I began to use the word you under that kind of encouragement. In the area where I meditate, there's an apricot tree. And I watch that tree the year round. And there comes a time in the fall, early winter, when I think of the tree, and at the same time I think of the Shakespeare sonnet, that time of year you may in me behold, when yellow leaves, or few or none, do hang upon the boughs that shake against the cold. And I think to myself, old tree, that's me too. Leaves are turning yellow, it's getting cold. You and I are in it together. Now that's, for me, that's a you relationship with a tree. And it isn't that I simply memorized the lines, it's that I experienced the you.
For Harry, the regular practice of living by heart is like meeting old friends at the local coffee shop each morning. It becomes a place of friendship with all that is, whether a phrase of poetry, an experience in nature, or the wonder of a young child.
I think that all of us should have some place, actually a physical place, where we can be, where we can meditate, where we can, you know, it's the old business of setting up a statue or setting up flowers or taking one place in the garden where we can go, which is not reserved entirely for meditating, but which fosters and helps us to meditate.
I began over a period of time to see how important it was that every day I build in a time of sitting in the same place. And at first it was inside. I had a pillow and I would sit for a few minutes. And then I began to move outside. And amazed myself, was amazed at how much the world opened up, and I had just not incorporated that into my daily life. And as I sat in my backyard, which is not an extraordinary backyard, I began to realize that even the sounds of the city could be nourishing. That every day a helicopter went over at exactly the same time to go check the traffic at a very major intersection of freeways that's not far from my house. And I came to count on that helicopter, and I began to imagine that it was part of my meditation. It was part of the regular order of things. In addition to a notebook for his by-heart poems and words of wisdom, Harry also keeps a journal which he calls his Dawn Book. Here he records what he experiences each morning. He says it helps him pay attention to the details of life.
I sit in the darkness or in the sunrise, and I wait. I wait for the sun to rise in the outside world, and I find myself almost asking the question, where are you, poets? Where are you? And they come, or maybe they don't come, but what frequently happens, it's almost palpable, is that a poem will thrust itself from my heart, as it were. At least it's in me, and it's like saying, holding up his hand, I've got something I want to say. When something happens that really is a surprise to me or a source of great pleasure, I simply write in the margins of my little book, aha. For example, I've written the word presence, symbolizing the feeling that I'm being encompassed and affected by something that's happening in the world around me. So I write presence, a soaring buzzard with great wings, glistening, wailing peacocks, so clear of 5:30 p.m. And opposite, I think it's a wonderful experience that I'm having right now. And I write opposite, on the opposite page, the word aha. I believe that all my life I've had a great kinship with the universe. And I've been very much interested in recent years to share the life of my 5-year-old great-grandchild and to observe how she relates to the universe and to everything in it as though it were a living thing, a living relationship.
Is the crow your favorite bird?
The crow is my favorite bird, right? Because he sings such a beautiful song.
Like that?
Which is your favorite bird?
Blue jays and robins.
Robins. The poet Rilke uses the phrase, rekindle commonplace. And that's what Alicia has done for us over and over again, just to rekindle what we take for granted. And it's been a great lesson, I think, for both of us. It certainly has influenced my meditating practices, to have the world opened again through her eyes and then through our own, to an experience of daily living as an experience of wonder, filled with what the psalmist calls the wine of astonishment. Her wonder, she's a wonder, but her wonder in the face of life reminds us that at our age we may have been close to that. She opens us up.
The practice of living by heart gives us some spaciousness, especially in our daily relationships. This is most apparent in the practice Harry calls family roster.
I think one of the essential ingredients in meditating, as I experience it, is the freedom to experiment and develop different forms and different practices. For example, I have developed a practice that I call the family roster. Each morning during my meditative period, I repeat the names of my family. The basis on which I do this is a photograph taken at a family picnic. I try to think and feel during the times I meditate what the individual relationship as I have to my wife and to my children, and to render quite concrete the problems and also the opportunities in these relationships.
I found that that was very helpful to me in relation to the people that I work with. Sometimes I will take my appointment book and move through the day and hold each task and each person in this very special way. And it gives me perspective. It shifts my perspective from perhaps a tunnel look at one person or a tunnel look at problems, and see the day in a much larger way. The landscape begins to open up, and I'm freer. Harry Scholefield has been an activist all his life. Living by heart is engaged living, actively facing the challenges and demands of the time from a center of strength.
I think that one of the major problems of a person who is seeking to live a full life, both personally and in terms of involvement in the political life as time, is where he or she moves from. I have seen many instances in my ministry of persons who were totally involved in social action, who burned themselves out, perhaps became bitter at the end. But I've seen another kind of person who lives from the center and whose mode of acting for peace or racial justice reflects a kind of inner strength and inner quietness. If I were asked what is perhaps the major motivating factor in taking an activist role in the events of the time in which I happen to live, I would say that the words of the 8th century Hebrew prophets were primary. The link between them and meditation is very, very strong. The fact that I keep them alive, know them by heart, helps me to be active in my daily life.
This practice is one of being open to all that is, including the darkness in life. We might want to plot and scheme ways to escape our problems, but living by heart opens us and gives us a sense of kinship even with our own darkness.
Over the years, I've formed the habit at night when I wake up with a problem, maybe thinking a while about the problem, which may be quite devastating and difficult. But then when the problem itself is out of control, my worry gauge is broken, I think of poems and songs. I go to a particular psalm, usually the 139th, which opens, has in it the lines, "Whither shall I go from thy spirit? Or whither shall I flee from thy presence? If I ascend up into heaven, thou art there." And then the very great line, "If I make my bed in hell, behold, thou art there." And further on there's a line about light and darkness, and the line is, "The darkness hideth not from thee, but the night shineth as the day, for darkness and light are one to thee." This is refocusing my thoughts and is removing me from the vexatious and sometimes terrifying thoughts that I have been having, which are repetitive and keeping me awake, and moving my mind and my heart into new territory. Meditating for me is a continuous process, so that what I am thinking at night relates to what I think of the next day. And it's a kind of continual music that goes on in me all the time.
After 47 years of marriage, Harry's wife Sarah became very sick. When she died, I saw how Harry opened his heart to the grief of his loss in the knowledge, as the old hymn says, that joy and woe are woven fine.
My life initially had a great deal of tragedy in it, and as a child, One of the things I observe now is that my life has taken a great turn. It's filled with marvelous surprises.
One of those surprises occurred one day as Harry waited outside an apartment before he was to go in for a meeting. Dean Bull, who was to chair that meeting, was inside.
I got to her apartment early, parked my car, and looked at the apartment, and she was moving around in the apartment wearing a white blouse. I don't know why that was significant, but it was. And I said to myself, I want to marry that woman. As I made my intentions known, Dean said, Harry, I'm really very fond of you, but I'm not interested in an intimate relationship. So I thought, well, it's going to take more time than I thought it was going to take. But I observed that she had a dog that she loved. And I figured, well, if I can convince the dog that I'm a suitable person, that's the first step, which I did. The dog became very fond of me, and having gotten the dog's approval, Dean considered me possible. Well, anyway, the wonderful thing is we got married. What happened to me is an illustration of how filled with surprises life can be as you approach old age. At the wedding, one of the readings we did was Robert Bly's A Third Body. A man and a woman sit near each other, and they do not long at this moment to be older or younger, nor born in any other nation or time or place. They are content to be where they are, talking or not talking. Their breaths together feed someone whom we do not know. The man sees the way his fingers move. He sees the way her hands close around a book she hands to him. They obey a third body that they share in common. They have made a promise to love that body. Age may come, parting may come, death will come. A man and a woman sit near each other. As they breathe, they feed someone whom we do not know, someone we know of, but we have never seen. I might say that's a wonderful description of presence.
Living by heart, as I have learned from Harry's teachings and his life, has several important parts. Collecting words of wisdom from the poets and the men and women of religion which especially nourish your heart and challenge your life. Living with these words and phrases until they become a storehouse of wisdom within you. Practicing the spirit of welcome in your daily life, greeting life with the spirit of hospitality, so you will be open to the surprises when they come. Choosing your stance for the day when you rise in the morning, especially choosing hope over fear. Writing down the way you encounter the you of life, whether it is in the words of the poet, in the faces of your family, or in nature all around you. Developing your sense of kinship with all that is. Sitting each day and waiting in the presence of the you or thou of life. Over time, living by heart will become a way of being as your sense of wonder is enlarged and your ability to live in and even welcome the darkness is strengthened and your kinship with all of life is deepened. Living by heart will move you not away from the world and its problems, but into the world, actively engaging yourself from a center of strength.
Silent friend of many distances, feel how your breath enlarges all of space. Let your presence ring out like a bell into the night. And if the earthly no longer knows your name, whisper To the silent earth, I'm flowing. To the flashing water, say,